May 4th, 1945. Kufstein, Austria. The Sherman tank engine rumbled to an idle as First Lieutenant John Kerry Lee Jr. sat atop the turret of his M4A3 Sherman, studying the Austrian countryside spread before him like a crumpled map. The 27-year-old tank commander from Norwich, New York, had led his men through 5 months of relentless combat across France and Germany, earning a Bronze Star along the way. His tank, affectionately named Besotten Jenny by one of his African-American crew members after a cheating girlfriend back home, had become his second home. But what happened next would cement this ordinary spring morning into one of the most extraordinary moments in military history. Within hours, Lee would find himself commanding not just American soldiers, but German Wehrmacht troops and French political prisoners in a desperate battle against the very army he had been fighting for years. The mathematics of war were about to be rewritten in the most unexpected way imaginable. The Battle of Castle Itter would become the only recorded engagement in World War II, where American and German soldiers fought side by side as allies, defending French prisoners against a fanatical SS assault. This wasn't propaganda or fiction. This was the last battle of World War II in Europe, and nobody who participated would ever forget what happened on that hill overlooking the Austrian Alps. The seeds of this impossible alliance had been planted 3 years earlier, in 1943, when Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust and commander of the SS, decided to transform a medieval castle into a prison for France's most valuable hostages. Castle Itter, known locally as Schloss Itter, perched dramatically on a 666-metre knoll at the entrance to the Brixental Valley, approximately 5 kilometres south of the town of Wörgl and 20 kilometres west of Kitzbühel. The structure had existed as a fortress since at least 1241, though historians suspected earlier constructions might have occupied the site since the 10th century. The castle had been rebuilt in 1532, then renovated extensively in 1878, eventually becoming a hotel in the early 20th century. When Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss of 1938, the castle's fate changed dramatically. In late 1940, the German government officially leased the property from its owner, Franz Gruner. For 2 years, it remained relatively untouched, but on February 7, 1943, SS Lieutenant General Oswald Pohl, acting under direct orders from Heinrich Himmler, seized the castle from Gruner outright. Pohl headed the SS main economic and administrative office and served as the chief administrator of the concentration camps, making him a key figure in implementing the final solution. The transformation into a prison facility was completed by April 25, 1943, and the castle was placed under the administrative control of the Dachau concentration camp, located approximately 90 miles to the northwest. The prisoners who would eventually call this fortress home represented a who's who of French political and military elite, each one valuable to the Reich as potential bargaining chips or sources of intelligence. Former Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, 60 years old, had signed the Munich Agreement in 1938, attempting to appease Hitler. Despite his efforts to avoid war, Daladier had harboured no illusions about Hitler's ultimate goals, telling the British in April 1938 that Hitler's real aim was continental domination. After France's fall, he had been arrested by the Vichy government, tried for treason at the Riom trial, imprisoned in Fort du Portelet, then handed over to the Germans in 1943. He spent months in Buchenwald before being transferred to Itter in May 1943. His political rival and successor, 66-year-old Paul Reynaud, occupied another cell. Reynaud had become premier in March 1940 and had adamantly opposed an armistice with Germany, fighting desperately to save France from occupation. He resigned on June 16, 1940, was arrested while attempting to flee, and spent time in Sachsenhausen and Fort du Portelet before arriving at the castle. The animosity between these two men ran deep, their political battles from the 1930s undiminished by shared captivity. Also imprisoned within the fortress walls were two former supreme commanders of the French armed forces. Maurice Gamelin, 72 years old, had unsuccessfully resisted the German advance in spring 1940 and remained bitter about his replacement. Maxime Weygand, the 78-year-old general who had replaced Gamelin as Supreme Commander in May 1940, had initially collaborated with the occupying Germans after France's surrender before being imprisoned in 1942. The mutual disdain between Gamelin and Weygand created constant tension. Tennis champion Jean Borotra, 46 years old and known as the Bounding Basque of Biarritz, had won Wimbledon twice in his 20s. He was imprisoned because he had resigned as Vichy France's Commissioner for Sport and Physical Education in April 1942, and was later caught attempting to flee the country to join Allied forces. Marie-Agnès de Gaulle, elder sister of Free French leader Charles de Gaulle and a member of the resistance, arrived in April 1945, just weeks before the end of the war. The roster also included François de la Rocque, the right-wing leader who despised labour organiser Léon Jouot, Michel Clemenceau, 71 years old and son of the World War I-era premier, and several others whose political diversity matched only their determination to maintain old rivalries despite shared captivity. They ate at separate tables in the small dining room, their heated exchanges providing perverse entertainment for their German captors. Despite the interpersonal tensions, life at ITA was considerably better than at virtually any other German-run prison. The French inmates slept in converted hotel guest rooms, had free access to the castle's substantial library, and took daily exercise in a courtyard built around a 13th-century fountain. Daladier even maintained a clandestine radio in his room, courtesy of sympathetic guards, on which he secretly listened to BBC broadcasts. The facility was staffed by a small contingent of SS guards from the Totenkopfverbände and a group of Eastern European prisoners from Dachau who performed maintenance tasks. Among these workers was Zvonimir Chuchkovic, a Croatian electrician and handyman, who was also a member of the Yugoslav communist resistance. The prison's commandant, Captain Sebastian Wimmer, ran the facility with a mixture of military discipline and occasional attempts at civility. By late April 1945, as Allied forces closed in from all sides and Hitler's thousand-year Reich collapsed into rubble and chaos, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. The prisoners shared a growing fear that as the end approached, the SS would begin exterminating prisoners to cover up their crimes. This was not paranoia. Throughout Germany and occupied territories, SS units were systematically murdering prisoners before Allied troops could liberate them. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin as Soviet forces closed in on the Reich Chancellery. The war in Europe was effectively over, but fanatic elements continued fighting, unwilling to accept defeat. On May 2nd, Eduard Weiter, the former commandant of Dachau concentration camp, fled to the castle as American troops liberated his former domain. He died that same day under unclear circumstances. His death terrified Captain Wimmer, who feared he might be next. On May 4th, with Allied troops clearly approaching and artillery audible in the distance, Wimmer made a decision that would save his own life and potentially doom his prisoners. He abandoned his post, fleeing with most of his guards. The SS Totenkopfverbände guards followed their commandant's lead, disappearing into the surrounding countryside. Suddenly, 14 French VIP prisoners found themselves in control of a medieval fortress, armed only with the small arms their guards had left behind. The prisoners were technically free, but freedom was an illusion. The surrounding area crawled with Waffen-SS troops who remained fanatically loyal to the Nazi cause, despite Hitler's death. SS forces commanded by Oberführer Georg Bochmann occupied hills near the fortress and had been given orders to descend on ITA and execute all remaining prisoners. If the French tried to escape on foot, they would almost certainly be killed on sight. Their only hope lay in reaching Allied forces before Bochmann's men reached them. Daladier and Reynaud, putting aside their political enmity in the face of mortal danger, met to discuss their options. They needed to send someone for help, someone who could slip past SS patrols and reach American lines. They decided to send Čučković, the Croatian handyman who had worked at the fortress throughout their captivity. On May 3rd, Čučković left under the pretext of running an errand. The town of Vrgl lay 8 kilometers down the mountain, but it was occupied by German troops. Instead, he pressed on up the Inn River valley toward Innsbruck, 64 kilometers distant. The journey was treacherous. Waffen-SS units patrolled the roads, shooting anyone suspected of desertion or collaboration. Austrian civilians who hung white flags from their windows were fired upon by roaming execution squads. Males of military age were summarily executed as possible deserters. Čučković moved carefully, avoiding main roads when possible, taking advantage of his knowledge of the terrain and his ability to pass as a local worker. Late on the evening of May 3rd, exhausted and footsore, he reached the outskirts of Innsbruck and encountered an advance party of the 409th Infantry Regiment of the American 103rd Infantry Division, part of the U.S. 6th Corps. Čučković quickly informed the American officers about the fortress and its high-profile French prisoners. The Americans recognized the strategic and political importance of the information. At dawn on May 4th, Major John T. Kramers organized a heavily armored rescue mission. Tanks, half-tracks and infantry from the 103rd Division began moving toward the castle. The relief column made good progress initially, but just past the town of Jenbach, approximately halfway to Itter, German artillery opened fire. Heavy shells rained down, forcing the column to halt. Kramers faced a difficult decision, but superior officers made it for him, recalling the column and citing concerns about encroaching into territory designated as the operational area of the U.S. 36th Infantry Division. Military bureaucracy and territorial concerns took precedence. Only 2 jeeps carrying auxiliary personnel were allowed to continue, but without armour or infantry support, they would be unable to mount a meaningful rescue if they encountered the SS. Back at the fortress, the prisoners waited anxiously for Čučković's return, unaware that his mission had been partially successful but ultimately ineffective. As the hours stretched into a full day with no word, their anxiety grew. They had armed themselves with rifles, submachine guns and pistols left behind by the guards, but 14 elderly politicians and a tennis player would be no match for trained Waffen-SS combat troops. They needed another plan. Among the Eastern European workers who had remained was Andreas Krobot, a Czech cook who had served meals to both the prisoners and their guards throughout the war. Krobot volunteered to bicycle to Vrgl despite the danger. The prisoners provided him with a letter explaining their situation and the imminent threat they faced. At midday on May 4th, Krobot mounted his bicycle and pedalled down the mountain road toward Vrgl, carrying the letter and their desperate hopes. The 8-kilometre journey normally took less than an hour, but these were not normal times. The roads were dangerous, filled with retreating Wehrmacht soldiers, advancing Allied patrols, and roaming execution squads looking for deserters and traitors to shoot. As Krobot approached Vrgl, Wehrmacht forces had recently abandoned the town, but it had been promptly reoccupied by roaming Waffen-SS troops. The town's Austrian residents had hung white sheets and Austrian flags from their windows, signalling their intent to surrender to approaching American forces without resistance. SS head Heinrich Himmler had issued explicit orders that any town attempting to surrender rather than fighting the Allies was guilty of treason, and all military-age males were to be shot on sight. The SS took these orders seriously. Snipers watched the windows, and execution squads patrolled the streets. As Krobot entered the outskirts of Vrgl, an SS patrol spotted him. He was seconds from being stopped, questioned, and likely shot when a door burst open and someone pulled him roughly into a nearby house. His saviour was Major Josef Sepp Gangl of the Wehrmacht, a career soldier who had served in the German army since joining the Reichswehr on November 1st, 1928, 7 years before the Reichswehr became the Wehrmacht in 1935. Gangel had commanded a battery with 105mm howitzers at the Battle of Kiev in Ukraine in 1941 as part of Army Group South on the Eastern Front. He had fought at the defence of Caen in Normandy in June 1944 and at the Battle of the Bulge near Bastogne in December 1944. The exact moment of his transformation remains unclear, but by May 1945 he had made a choice that would have earned him execution if discovered by the SS. He had defied orders to retreat and instead thrown in his lot with the Austrian resistance, led by local leader Rupert Hagleitner. Gangel commanded the remains of a Wehrmacht artillery unit, approximately 10 to 20 soldiers who shared their commander's disillusionment with the Nazi cause. These men had chosen to risk execution for treason rather than continue serving a regime they had come to despise. When Andreas Krobot explained the situation at Itter to Major Gangel, the German officer immediately understood the gravity and the opportunity. 14 French VIP prisoners, including 2 ex-premiers and the sister of Charles de Gaulle, were trapped 8 kilometers away, awaiting execution by the SS. If Gangel could help rescue them, it might partially atone for years spent serving a criminal regime. It might prove that not all German soldiers were monsters, but Gangel also recognized that his small force was woefully insufficient to defend the fortress against the 100 or more SS troops reportedly in the area. He needed help, and there was only one place to find it. Taking an enormous personal risk, Major Gangel grabbed a white flag, climbed into his Kubelwagen command car with Krobot beside him, and drove north toward the sound of American artillery. He was driving toward the enemy he had been fighting for years, hoping they wouldn't shoot him on sight. Approximately 8 kilometers north of Wörgl, in the Austrian border town of Kufstein, a reconnaissance unit of 4 M4A3 Sherman tanks from the 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division, US 21st Corps, sat in the town square, waiting to be relieved by the 36th Infantry Division. The unit's commander, First Lieutenant John Carey Lee Jr., was a stocky, cigar-chewing, whiskey-drinking 27-year-old from Norwich, New York. Lee's crew knew him as Captain Jack, a nickname that reflected both his leadership style and his men's affection for him. Lee was a graduate of Norwich University, a military college in Vermont, and had earned a Bronze Star during 5 months of continuous combat leading Company B of the 23rd Tank Battalion across France and Germany. His crew included Sergeant William Rushford, Corporal Edward J. Shimchick, a quiet but deadly accurate gunner from New York, Corporal Edward J. Siner, and Private First Class Herbert G. McHaley. The relationship between Lee and his men was built on 5 months of shared danger and mutual respect. When Major Gangel's Kubelwagen rolled into Kufstein on the afternoon of May 4th, flying an enormous white flag, American sentries nearly opened fire before recognizing the surrender signal. Gangel stepped out slowly, hands raised, still wearing his Wehrmacht uniform and decorations. He was taken immediately to Lee's forward position. Through a combination of Gangel's decent English and gestures, the German major explained the situation. 14 French VIP prisoners trapped in a fortress 8 kilometers away. Waffen-SS forces preparing to attack and execute them. A small Wehrmacht force willing to fight against the SS to protect the prisoners. American help desperately needed. Most American officers, exhausted after 5 months of combat and with peace just days away, would have been reluctant to risk their men's lives in the final hours of the war for a mission far outside their operational area involving cooperation with enemy soldiers. John Lee was not most officers. Without hesitation, Lee volunteered to lead a rescue mission. He radioed his battalion headquarters, explained the situation, and requested permission to mount a rescue operation. His superiors, recognizing both the military value of rescuing high-profile French prisoners and Lee's determination to attempt the mission regardless of permission, approved the operation. Lee immediately began organizing his relief force. Lee's initial plan was ambitious. He would take Besotten Jenny plus Lieutenant Wallace S. Holbrook's Bosch Buster, along with 6 soldiers from the All-African American Company D, 17th Armoured Infantry Battalion, to ride atop the tanks as extra firepower. At the last moment, recognizing the need for additional armour, Lee requisitioned 5 more Shermans and supporting infantry from the recently arrived 142nd Infantry Regiment of the 36th Division. The column that rolled out of Kufstein on the afternoon of May 4th represented an extraordinary alliance forged in the dying hours of World War II. Leading the column was Lee's Sherman, its 76mm gun traversing slowly as Lee scanned for threats. Behind it came Holbrook's Boche Buster and 5 additional Shermans from the 142nd Regiment. 6 African-American soldiers from the 17th Armoured Infantry Battalion clung to the tank's hulls, their rifles at the ready. Major Gangl rode in his Kubelwagen alongside Lee's lead tank, with Andreas Krobot beside him to show the way. Following behind was a truck carrying Gangl's 10 Wehrmacht soldiers, wearing their German uniforms and carrying German weapons. This mixed American-German column represented something unprecedented in modern warfare. Enemies who had been trying to kill each other for years were now riding together toward a common objective, united by a shared belief that some things transcended national allegiance. The journey was fraught with danger. As the column approached the first river crossing, Lee discovered that the bridge could support his lighter Shermans, but might collapse under the weight if the entire column crossed at once. Rather than risk losing tanks or causing a traffic jam that would make his force vulnerable to attack, Lee made a difficult decision. He sent the 5 requisitioned Shermans from the 142nd Regiment back, reducing his relief force to just 2 tanks, 6 infantry, and Gangl's Wehrmacht soldiers. The mission continued with a significantly reduced force, but Lee calculated that 2 Shermans with their 76mm guns and 50 caliber machine guns would provide sufficient firepower to hold off an assault until reinforcements could arrive. As the column approached Wörgl, they encountered scattered resistance. A brief firefight erupted as Lee's lead tank engaged an SS machine gun nest being set up to cover the road. The Sherman's 50 caliber machine gun and main gun made short work of the position, scattering the survivors into the woods. The column rumbled through Wörgl, where Austrian civilians waved cautiously from windows. The town was still dangerous, with snipers in some buildings and German troops loyal to the Nazi cause hiding in cellars and attics. Major Gangl directed Lee to leave 1 tank and some infantry behind to support the Austrian resistance fighters. Lee agreed, detaching Boche Buster and Lieutenant Holbrook's crew to hold Wörgl. Now, Lee's relief force consisted of only Besotten Jenny, 6 African-American infantrymen, and Major Gangl's Wehrmacht soldiers. It was a pitifully small force to defend a fortress against 100 or more SS troops, but there was no time to wait for reinforcements. As the reduced column approached the village of Itter in the early evening of May 4th, they encountered another obstacle. A bridge on the approach had been wired with explosives by retreating German forces. The demolition charges were visible, wires running to a detonator hidden in the surrounding brush. Major Gangl personally dismounted and, with several of his Wehrmacht soldiers, carefully disconnected the detonator and cut the wires, disarming the explosives. The incident reminded everyone how precarious their situation had become. As the column approached the fortress itself, a bizarre scene unfolded. 2 French prisoners, acting as improvised sentries with German rifles left behind by the guards, challenged the approaching vehicles. When they recognized the American tank and saw Andreas Krobot waving from the Kubelwagen, excitement rippled through the fortress. The word spread instantly. American troops had arrived. They were saved. When First Lieutenant Lee climbed down from his turret and entered the courtyard, he was greeted by a sight that would have seemed comical under different circumstances. 14 elderly French prisoners crowded forward to shake his hand and thank him in rapid French. The ex-premiers Daladier and Reynaud, political enemies who had barely spoken to each other in months, both rushed forward to greet their rescuer. Tennis champion Borotra pumped Lee's hand with vigour. Marie-Agnès de Gaulle expressed her gratitude with characteristic French formality. The prisoners' enthusiasm was tempered by concern when they realized the size of Lee's relief force. They had hoped for a battalion, perhaps a full company at minimum. Instead, they received one Sherman tank, fewer than a dozen American soldiers, and a handful of German Wehrmacht troops. Major Gangl found himself in the awkward position of being introduced to the French prisoners he had come to rescue. Some, particularly the military men like Generals Gamelin and Weygand, regarded the German major with suspicion and barely concealed hostility. Others, recognizing the courage required for Gangl to turn against his own army, offered cautious respect. The prisoners also introduced Lee to another unexpected defender. Captain Kurt Siegfried Schrader, an SS Hauptsturmführer who had been convalescing in the nearby village after being wounded in combat, had befriended some of the French prisoners during his recovery. When the guards fled and the prisoners realized they were in danger, they had asked Schrader to take charge of their defense. Schrader, like Gangl, had become disillusioned with the Nazi regime and had chosen to protect the prisoners rather than abandon them. Schrader had moved his own family into the fortress for protection, calculating correctly that his former SS comrades would execute him as a traitor if they discovered his role in defending French prisoners. The presence of an SS officer fighting alongside Wehrmacht soldiers and Americans against other SS troops added yet another layer of surreal complexity to the situation. Lee now commanded the strangest military force assembled during World War II. His own crew of American tankers, 6 African-American infantry soldiers, 10 to 20 Wehrmacht soldiers under Major Gangl's command, 1 SS officer who had rejected his oath to Hitler, and 14 French prisoners who had armed themselves with whatever weapons the guards had left behind. Black Americans, white Americans, German Wehrmacht troops, a former SS officer, and French prisoners of wildly varying political persuasions, all preparing to fight together against fanatical Waffen-SS troops. Lee immediately took command of the fortress defense, applying professional military judgment to a situation that defied any tactics he had learned at Norwich University. He conducted a quick reconnaissance of the castle's defensive capabilities and found them surprisingly favourable. The structure occupied high ground overlooking the approaches from all directions. Its stone walls, while not designed for modern warfare, would stop small arms fire and even provide some protection against artillery fragments. The medieval design included several fallback positions, allowing defenders to retreat deeper into the structure if the outer walls were breached. Lee identified what he called the Keep, an inner stronghold where defenders could make a final stand if necessary. The main entrance, a large wooden gate with a stone archway, provided a natural choke point. Lee positioned Besot-en-Jenny directly in front of this gate, its 76mm gun pointing down the main approach road. The tank would serve as both a mobile pillbox and a steel barrier preventing the SS from simply driving vehicles through the gate. Lee placed his American infantry and Gangl's Wehrmacht soldiers in defensive positions around the perimeter walls, covering all approaches with overlapping fields of fire. The French prisoners, despite Lee's orders to take cover inside, insisted on joining the defence. Generals Gamelin and Weygand, both in their 70s, took positions with rifles. Tennis champion Borotra grabbed a submachine gun. Even 71-year-old Michel Clemenceau picked up a rifle and found a firing position overlooking the main approach. The defenders had adequate small arms ammunition, left behind by the fleeing guards, but no way to resupply if the battle lasted more than a few hours. As darkness fell on May 4th, the defenders settled in for what they knew would be a long night. Lee ordered strict light discipline. The SS were out there in the darkness, and Lee had no intention of making his position any easier to attack than necessary. Major Gangl shared intelligence about the SS forces in the area. Waffen-SS troops commanded by Oberführer Georg Bochmann had been occupying hills and woods around the fortress for days. These were not garrison troops or rear echelon soldiers. They were hardened combat veterans who had fought on multiple fronts and remained fanatically loyal despite Hitler's death. Gangl estimated their strength at between 100 and 150 men, possibly more, equipped with small arms, machine guns, mortars, and at least one 88mm anti-tank gun. The defenders, by contrast, numbered fewer than 40, including the French prisoners. The odds were not favourable. Throughout the night of May 4th to 5th, SS reconnaissance patrols probed the defences, testing for weaknesses and assessing the strength of the defensive force. Shots rang out periodically as American and German defenders fired at shadows and movement in the darkness. The SS did not launch a major assault during the night, preferring to wait for daylight when they could coordinate their attack and bring their superior numbers to bear. Inside the fortress, the unlikely coalition tried to rest in shifts while maintaining watch. American soldiers shared cigarettes and coffee with Wehrmacht troops who, just days earlier, they would have been trying to kill. The French prisoners talked quietly among themselves, their political differences temporarily forgotten in the face of shared danger. As dawn broke on May 5, 1945, the defenders could see what they faced. Waffen-SS troops had taken up positions in the woods surrounding the fortress during the night, using the cover of darkness to move into assault positions. The morning mist rising from the valley floor provided additional concealment as the SS finalized their preparations. At approximately 7 o'clock in the morning, the attack began. The distinctive crack of German Mauser rifles and the deeper rattle of MG-42 machine guns shattered the morning quiet. Bullets whined off the stone walls and sang through the air above the defenders' heads. Lee's tank crew responded immediately, traversing Besotten Jenny's turret toward the muzzle flashes in the woods and returning fire with the .50 caliber machine gun. The assault began in earnest around 8 o'clock, when a force of between 100 and 150 Waffen-SS soldiers advanced toward the fortress. The attackers moved with professional discipline, using fire and maneuver tactics, with one group providing covering fire while another moved forward. The defenders poured rifle and machine gun fire into the advancing troops, forcing them to take cover and slowing their advance. Besotten Jenny's 76mm gun boomed repeatedly, high explosive shells detonating among the SS positions, throwing earth and shrapnel in all directions. The Sherman's machine guns rattled continuously, forcing the attackers to keep their heads down. On the walls, American soldiers, German Wehrmacht troops, and French prisoners fought side by side. Corporal Edward J. Shimczyk, Lee's gunner, methodically worked his way through targets, adjusting his aim after each shot with the precision that had made him legendary in Company B. The 6 African-American soldiers from the 17th Armoured Infantry Battalion, veterans of months of combat across Europe, fired with disciplined accuracy, making every shot count. Major Gangl moved constantly along the defensive perimeter, directing his Wehrmacht soldiers, encouraging the defenders, and coordinating fire with Lee. The German major's experience showed in the way he anticipated enemy tactics and positioned his men to counter each assault. Former General Maurice Gamelin, who had commanded all French forces at the start of the war, found himself once again under fire. The 72-year-old general handled his rifle with the competence of a man who had spent a lifetime in military service. Jean Borotra moved from position to position with the athleticism that had made him a tennis champion, carrying ammunition to defenders who were running low and helping wounded men to cover. The SS pressed their attack with fanatical determination. Small groups of stormtroopers attempted to rush the gate, only to be driven back by Besotten Jenny's machine guns and concentrated rifle fire from the walls. Mortar rounds began falling inside the courtyard, forcing defenders to take cover and disrupting their defensive fire. Around mid-morning, Major Gangl managed to reach the Austrian resistance in Wörgl by telephone, requesting immediate reinforcements. The resistance could offer little help, only 3 additional fighters, 2 German soldiers who had joined Gangl's Wehrmacht group, and an Austrian teenager who had been fighting with the partisans. These 3 brave men climbed into a car and drove toward the fortress through roads still patrolled by SS execution squads, reaching the stronghold and joining the defenders just as the situation was becoming desperate. By noon, the defenders were running critically low on ammunition, every bullet had to count. Lee ordered his men to fire only at clearly visible targets to make every shot matter. The Sherman's ammunition storage was more than half depleted, with high-explosive shells running particularly low. Worse still, Bochmann's forces had brought up their ace weapon. The distinctive crack of an 88mm gun echoed across the valley, and seconds later, a high-velocity anti-tank round slammed into besotten Jenny. The German 88mm gun was one of the most feared weapons of World War II, originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon, but equally effective against tanks and fortifications. The round punched through the Sherman's armour, disabling the tank's ability to fight. Lee ordered his crew to abandon the vehicle and fall back to the walls. Without besotten Jenny's guns providing suppressive fire, the attackers pressed their advantage, advancing closer to the gate. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, as ammunition ran critically low and the SS prepared what appeared to be a final assault on the gate, Major Joseph Gangl noticed former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud exposed to fire from an SS sniper position in the woods. The 66-year-old Reynaud stood near a window, seemingly unaware of the danger. Gangl, without hesitation, rushed across the courtyard to pull Reynaud to safety. As the German major reached Reynaud and began pushing him away from the window, a 7.92 by 57mm Mauser round fired by an SS sniper struck Gangl in the head. The shot was instantly fatal. Major Josef Sepp Gangl, who had served in the German army since joining the Reichswehr on November 1, 1928, who had fought from the Battle of Kiev in Ukraine to Normandy to Bastogne, who had survived years of brutal combat, only to reject Nazi ideology and join the Austrian resistance, who had risked everything to save 14 French prisoners he had never met, fell defending the man he had come to protect. His body collapsed at Reynaud's feet. The defenders, seeing their German ally fall, were momentarily stunned. Then anger replaced shock. The firing intensified as American soldiers, German Wehrmacht troops and French prisoners poured fire toward the sniper position. Lee made a tactical decision that undoubtedly saved the fortress. He began pulling his defenders off the outer walls and consolidating them deeper inside, preparing for a final stand in the keep. As Lee organized this fighting withdrawal, an SS squad was bringing a Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket into position to blow open the main gate. Once the gate was destroyed, nothing would stop Bochmann's men from storming into the courtyard and executing everyone inside. Tennis champion Jean Barotra approached Lee with an audacious proposal. He would vault the wall, run through the SS lines, and reach the American reinforcements that Lee had called for hours earlier. It was a suicide mission. The odds of Barotra, a man of 46, successfully running through a gauntlet of SS troops who were actively trying to kill him, were vanishingly small. But Barotra had been a world-class athlete, and at 46, he retained much of his speed and agility. More importantly, he understood that if he didn't try, everyone in the fortress would die. Lee, seeing no alternative and respecting the Frenchman's courage, agreed. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jean Barotra, the bounding Basque, lived up to his nickname one final time. He climbed to the top of the wall, paused for just a moment, and then leaped down to the ground outside, a drop of several meters that he absorbed with the rolling landing technique he had perfected in decades of athletic competition. Barotra landed, rolled to his feet, and ran. SS troops saw him immediately and opened fire. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet and whined past his head. Barotra dodged and weaved, using every bit of speed and agility he possessed, running as he had never run before. He disappeared into the woods, the SS firing after him, and for long minutes the defenders had no idea whether he had been killed or had somehow made it through. Inside the fortress, the situation was becoming hopeless. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The defenders could see SS troops preparing for a final assault. The Panzerfaust team was moving into position. Lee gathered his remaining men, American and German, in the keep, preparing for close-quarters combat with bayonets and rifle butts when the ammunition ran out. The French prisoners, refusing to hide, stood with their rifles alongside the professional soldiers, determined to go down fighting. Daladier and Reynaud stood side by side, their political enmity forgotten. General Weygand, who had collaborated with the Germans after France's surrender, prepared to die fighting them. It was a moment that would have been impossible to imagine just days earlier. Then, at approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a sound echoed from the direction of the main road. Not the crack of German weapons, but the deeper boom of American tank cannons and the distinctive sound of American 50-caliber machine guns. The SS troops preparing to assault the gate suddenly came under fire from behind. Sherman tanks from the 142nd Infantry Regiment, responding to Lee's earlier call for reinforcements, and guided to the fortress by Jean Barotra, who had miraculously survived his run through enemy lines, had arrived at the critical moment. The relief column included multiple tanks and a company of infantry, more than enough force to turn the tide. Bochmann's men, caught between the defenders in the fortress and the American relief force, broke and ran. Some were cut down as they fled. Others threw down their weapons and surrendered. Approximately 100 SS prisoners were taken by the American relief force, while the rest scattered into the woods, disappearing into the Austrian countryside where many would evade capture for weeks. The Battle of Castle Itter was over. The unlikeliest battle of World War II had lasted approximately 9 hours, from the first shots at dawn to the arrival of the relief force in late afternoon. In that time, approximately 40 defenders, including 14 elderly French prisoners, had held off between 100 and 150 SS troops, inflicting significant casualties and preventing the execution of 14 people who would play crucial roles in rebuilding France after the war. The cost of this remarkable victory was incredibly light considering the odds. 4 defenders were wounded, none seriously enough to be life-threatening. Only 1 defender died during the battle. Major Joseph Sepp Gangl, shot by an SS sniper while protecting Paul Reynaud, gave his life for a cause he had served for only a few days, but had embraced completely. The French prisoners were evacuated to France that same evening, travelling under American military escort through Austria and Germany to Paris, where they arrived on May 10, 1945. For his extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, First Lieutenant John C. Lee, Jr. was promoted to captain and awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for soldiers who display extraordinary heroism in combat with an armed enemy force. The citation accompanying Lee's award read in part, "Captain Lee, with a small group of soldiers, infiltrated into hostile territory, demoralized enemy forces, prevented the destruction of 2 key bridges, and caused 200 German soldiers to surrender. He found many prominent French prisoners at Itter Castle and immediately organized a defense with both American and German troops. Despite a fanatical SS attack and heavy artillery barrage, Captain Lee's men held until friendly troops arrived. Captain Lee's intrepid actions, personal bravery, and zealous devotion to duty exemplify the highest traditions of the military forces of the United States. Lee would die in 1973, having lived a full life, but never forgetting the strange battle he fought on a hill in Austria in the war's final hours. Major Joseph Gangl was honoured as an Austrian national hero, and a street in the town of Wörgl was named after him. The Sepp-Gangl-Strasse serves as a permanent reminder that courage and humanity can transcend national allegiance, and that redemption is possible even in the darkest circumstances. Captain Kurt Siegfried Schrader, the SS officer who had fought alongside Americans and Germans to protect the French prisoners, was arrested after the battle and charged by US forces for his former affiliation with the Nazi Party and the SS. He received a 2-year sentence, which was subsequently shortened in recognition of his efforts at Itter. Schrader lived until 1995, carrying with him the knowledge that in the final days of the war he had chosen to protect innocents rather than participate in their murder. The Battle of Castle Itter has been dubbed by popular accounts and historians as the strangest battle of World War II, and with good reason. It was fought 5 days after Adolf Hitler's suicide, and only 3 days before Germany's unconditional surrender on May 7, 1945, which took effect on May 8 at 23:01 Central European Time. It represents the only known engagement in World War II where American and German soldiers fought together as allies against other German forces. It featured American tankers, African-American infantry, German Wehrmacht soldiers, a former SS officer, French prisoners spanning the political spectrum from right-wing to labor union leadership, and Austrian resistance fighters, all united against fanatical SS troops. Édouard Daladier, after his liberation, returned to French politics and was elected to the Chamber of Deputies in 1946, serving until 1958. He provided continuity and experience in rebuilding France's democratic institutions after years of Vichy collaboration and German occupation. He also served as mayor of Avignon from 1953 to 1958. Daladier died in Paris on October 10, 1970, at the age of 86, having lived long enough to see France transformed into a prosperous democracy and founding member of the European Economic Community. Paul Reynaud also returned to political life after liberation, elected to the Chamber of Deputies in 1946 and appointed to several cabinet positions during the Fourth Republic. He remained a prominent figure in French politics for years, advocating for European integration and Franco-German reconciliation. Reynaud never forgot that a German major died saving his life, and he spoke publicly about Gangel's courage on multiple occasions. Reynaud died on September 21, 1966, at the age of 87. Generals Maurice Gamelin and Maxime Weygand, despite their mutual antipathy and checkered records during France's defeat in 1940, both contributed to post-war France in different ways. Gamelin wrote extensively about the fall of France and the lessons learned from military defeat. Weygand faced legal consequences for his collaboration with Vichy France, but was eventually cleared and lived quietly until his death. Both men provided institutional memory and professional military expertise as France rebuilt its armed forces. Tennis champion Jean Borotra, whose athletic prowess and courage had helped save the fortress defenders by running through SS fire to reach reinforcements, returned to tennis and sports administration. He continued playing competitive tennis into his 70s and became a beloved figure in French sports, always willing to tell the story of the strangest battle of World War II and the unlikely heroes who fought it. Borotra died on July 17, 1994, at the age of 95. Léon Jouhaux, the trade union leader whose presence at the fortress alongside right-wing figures like François de la Roque had created constant tension, returned to labour activism and was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1951 for his efforts in promoting international labour rights and cooperation. He died in 1954, having helped shape post-war labour relations in France. François de la Roque, despite his right-wing politics and leadership of the Croix de Feu organisation in the 1930s, had been imprisoned for his resistance activities under Vichy. After liberation, he returned to France, but remained largely out of public life until his death in 1946. Marie-Agnès de Gaulle, elder sister of General Charles de Gaulle, returned to France and provided quiet support for her brother's political career, as he led France first as head of the Provisional Government and later as President of the Fifth Republic. She lived a long life, dying in 1982, proud of her brother's achievements and her own role in the resistance. The 14 French prisoners who survived went on to formulate many of the policies that carried France into the 21st century. Their experiences during the war, including their unlikely rescue by American and German soldiers fighting together, influenced their thinking about European cooperation, Franco-German reconciliation, and the importance of international institutions in preventing future wars. The European Coal and Steel Community, established in 1951, and its successor, the European Economic Community, established in 1957, bore the fingerprints of leaders who had learned hard lessons about nationalism, collaboration, and the capacity for former enemies to become allies. The story of the battle became a legend within military circles, but remained relatively unknown to the general public for decades after the war. The participants, with characteristic modesty, did not seek publicity or glorification. John Lee returned to civilian life in America and rarely spoke publicly about his experiences. The German soldiers who had fought alongside Americans faced potential prosecution for their service in the Wehrmacht and preferred to remain anonymous. The French prisoners, many of whom went on to prominent positions in post-war government, focused on rebuilding France rather than recounting wartime adventures. It was not until 2013, when military historian Stephen Harding published his book The Last Battle, that the full story became widely known. Harding's exhaustive research, drawing on American military records, German archives, French personal accounts, and Austrian local histories, reconstructed the battle in remarkable detail and brought attention to one of World War II's most extraordinary but overlooked engagements. The book's success led to renewed interest in the battle. The Swedish power metal band Sabaton released a song titled The Last Battle on their 2016 album The Last Stand, bringing the story to a new generation through music. Documentary producers, film studios, and historians expressed interest in the story, recognizing its universal themes of courage, redemption, and the capacity of former enemies to become allies in defense of shared values. Castle Itter itself, the stage for this extraordinary drama, returned to private ownership after the war and remains privately owned today. It is not open to the public, and there is no public monument to the battle, though local historians and residents of the Itter area maintain the memory of what happened there. The fortress stands as its own monument, silent witness to a day when impossible became reality and enemies became brothers in arms. The military lessons have been studied at military academies and war colleges around the world. The battle demonstrates the importance of rapid decision-making in fluid situations, the value of combined arms tactics, even with minimal forces, and the defensive advantages of fortified positions, even against superior numbers. But the deeper lessons transcend military tactics. The battle proved that individuals can choose to reject evil ideologies even at personal risk, that redemption is possible even for those who have served criminal regimes, and that shared humanity can overcome national animosity when people are willing to look beyond uniforms and flags. The story of Major Josef Gangl, who turned against the Nazi regime he had served since 1928 and died protecting French prisoners from execution by his former comrades, became a powerful narrative in post-war Austria. Austria, which had been incorporated into the Third Reich through the Anschluss of 1938 and had provided enthusiastic support for Nazi policies, needed examples of Austrian resistance to help rebuild national identity. Gangl, along with the Austrian resistance fighters of Würgel, who fought alongside him, provided that example. The Sepp-Gangl-Strasse in Würgel serves not just as a memorial to one man, but as a reminder of what courage looks like when the world is ending and nothing makes sense except the imperative to do what is right. The African-American soldiers who fought at the fortress returned to an America that was still segregated, where their military service and valor earned them little respect or recognition in many parts of the country. The 6 men from Company D, 17th Armoured Infantry Battalion, who rode atop Sherman tanks into battle and fought alongside white Americans and German soldiers to protect French prisoners, came home to face discrimination and second-class citizenship. Their names are recorded in military records, but their individual stories after the war remain largely unknown. They represent the thousands of African-American soldiers who served with honour in World War II, despite facing racism at home, and whose service helped pave the way for the civil rights movement that would transform America in the decades after the war. The German Wehrmacht soldiers who fought alongside Americans faced uncertain futures after the war. Some were briefly held as prisoners of war before being released. Others melted back into Austrian or German society, carrying with them the secret knowledge that in the war's final days they had chosen to fight for something greater than national loyalty. Many never spoke publicly about their role, fearing retribution from former SS members or prosecution for their Wehrmacht service. The question of how German soldiers like Gangl and his men, and even the SS officer Schrader, came to reject Nazi ideology in the final days remains complex and important. The easy answer is that they saw defeat coming and wanted to be on the winning side. This explanation, while cynically plausible, does not fully account for their actions. If survival was their only goal, they could have simply deserted and hidden until American forces arrived, as thousands of German soldiers did in the final weeks. Instead, Gangl and his men actively sought out American forces, proposed a rescue mission that would put them in danger, and then fought alongside Americans against SS troops who would execute them as traitors if captured. This goes well beyond self-preservation. A more nuanced explanation recognizes that many German soldiers, even those who had served loyally for years, gradually became disillusioned as the true nature of the Nazi regime became impossible to ignore. The systematic murder of civilians, the suicidal military strategies that sacrificed soldiers' lives for no tactical gain, the SS's increasingly brutal treatment of German and Austrian civilians who showed any hint of defeatism, all contributed to a growing recognition that the regime they served was evil. For professional soldiers like Gangl, the final straw may have been the SS's orders to execute military-age males in towns that displayed white flags, essentially murdering German and Austrian civilians for wanting peace. A soldier could rationalize fighting for his country even under an evil regime, but being ordered to murder his own people for wanting the war to end crossed a line. Gangl's decision to join the Austrian resistance and protect the civilians of Wörgl from SS execution squads suggests this was his motivation. The rescue of the French prisoners then became an extension of this protective impulse, an opportunity to save innocents from murder by fanatics. Captain Kurt Siegfried Schrader's path to rejecting the SS was different but equally significant. As an SS officer, Schrader had sworn personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler and to the SS's code of absolute obedience. For him to turn against the organization that had defined his adult identity required a profound psychological break. The fact that he did so, that he moved his own family into the fortress to protect both them and the French prisoners, that he fought against his former comrades knowing he would be executed as a traitor if Borchmann's forces won, demonstrates that even members of fanatical organizations can experience moral awakening and choose a different path. The French prisoners displayed remarkable courage in fighting alongside their rescuers rather than hiding in the interior. These were elderly men, politicians and generals in their 60s and 70s, a tennis player in his mid-40s, all civilians by any reasonable definition. They had no military obligation to fight. Yet when Lee ordered them to take cover, they refused, insisting on manning defensive positions alongside the American and German soldiers. Gamelin and Weygand, despite their age and their checkered records during France's defeat in 1940, fought with rifles like young soldiers. Jean Borotra not only fought, but volunteered for the suicide mission of running through enemy lines to summon help. Michel Clemenceau, 71 years old, took up a rifle rather than hide in safety. This courage stemmed partly from military training for the generals and athletic conditioning for Borotra, but more fundamentally from recognition that everyone's survival depended on everyone fighting. They understood that if the SS breached the defences, they would all be executed. There would be no prisoners taken, no mercy shown. Their choice was to fight or die. They chose to fight. The political diversity among the French prisoners makes their unity in combat even more remarkable. Daladier and Reynaud were bitter political rivals who had barely spoken to each other in months of captivity. General Weygand had collaborated with Vichy France after the surrender, earning the contempt of resistance members. François de la Rocque's right-wing Croix de Feu organisation was anathema to Labour leader Léon Jouhaux. Yet in the crucible of combat, these differences evaporated. They fought as Frenchmen, as fellow prisoners, as human beings whose lives depended on cooperation. This temporary unity did not survive the war. most returned to their political battles afterward. But for one day they demonstrated that even the deepest political divisions can be transcended when survival demands it. The Battle of Castle Itter stands as one of World War II's most extraordinary engagements not because of its strategic importance, it changed no major outcomes, but because of what it reveals about human nature. In the war's final hours, when hatred should have been at its peak and cooperation impossible, Americans and Germans fought together. A Wehrmacht major and an SS captain rejected their oaths and died or risked death to protect enemy prisoners. French politicians set aside their feuds. African-American soldiers served with distinction despite knowing they would return to a segregated homeland. An Austrian resistance fought alongside former occupiers. A Croatian communist, a Czech cook, and a French tennis champion all played crucial roles in preventing a massacre. These unlikely alliances, forged in desperation but sustained by shared values, demonstrated that humanity's capacity for cooperation and compassion can survive even history's darkest moments. The relevance of the battle extends beyond World War II history. In an era of increasing political polarization, nationalism, and the demonization of opponents, the battle provides a powerful reminder that former enemies can become allies, that shared values can transcend national identity, and that individuals can choose to reject toxic ideologies even when doing so carries enormous personal risk. Major Josef Gangel's decision to turn against the Nazi regime did not erase his years of service. It did not make him a lifelong resistance fighter or rewrite his biography. It was simply one man, at one moment, making a choice to do what was right regardless of the cost. That choice cost him his life, but it also redeemed his legacy and demonstrated that it is never too late to reject evil and embrace what is right. The French prisoners at the fortress, representing vastly different political philosophies and harbouring genuine personal animosities toward each other, set aside those differences when survival required cooperation. They did not suddenly agree on politics or become friends. After the war, many returned to their old political battles. But on May 5, 1945, faced with execution by SS troops, they recognized that their shared humanity and shared danger mattered more than their political disagreements. First Lieutenant John Lee's willingness to risk his life and his men's lives to rescue prisoners he had never met, who were nationals of an allied country but foreign country, who could do nothing to advance his military career or personal interests, exemplifies a kind of moral courage that transcends national self-interest. Lee acted because it was right, not because it was strategic or beneficial. His decision to accept the help of German soldiers, trusting his former enemies to fight alongside him, showed a pragmatism and humanity that military doctrine rarely accounts for. Lee judged individuals by their actions in the present, not their uniforms or their past. Major Gangel wore a Wehrmacht uniform and had fought for Nazi Germany since 1928, but when he offered to help rescue French prisoners from execution, Lee accepted that offer without hesitation. This ability to see past categories and labels to the individual person making choices in the moment is a rare gift. The African-American soldiers who fought at the fortress, serving a country that treated them as second-class citizens, demonstrated a commitment to ideals rather than to imperfect realities. They fought for democracy and freedom even though those ideals were not fully extended to them at home. Their service throughout World War II helped create the moral foundation for the civil rights movement that would transform America in the following decades. Stephen Harding, whose book The Last Battle brought the story to public attention in 2013, wrote that the battle was important not just as a military engagement, but as a demonstration of what humans are capable of when they choose courage and principle over convenience and convention. Harding noted that every participant made choices that defied expectations. The Americans chose to risk their lives for foreign prisoners. The Germans chose to fight against their own countrymen. The French chose to fight alongside their German rescuers. The SS officer chose to reject his organization's fanaticism. Together, These choices created a moment of grace in the midst of humanity's darkest war. The popularity of Harding's book and the subsequent interest in the battle suggest that modern audiences hunger for stories that transcend simple narratives and reveal the complexity of human nature. The sight of Americans and Germans fighting together against a common enemy, even when those Germans had recently been the enemy, provides hope that reconciliation is possible, that former enemies can become allies, and that shared values can overcome historical enmity. The physical location of the fortress, standing on its hill overlooking the Austrian Alps, serves as a permanent reminder of what happened there. Though privately owned and not open to the public, it is visible from the surrounding valleys and villages. Local residents know its history. Tour guides mention it when visitors pass through the area. It has become part of the region's identity, a source of local pride that in the final hours of Europe's darkest war, Austrians, Americans, Germans and French stood together against evil. The Sepp-Gangl-Strasse in Wörgl ensures that Josef Gangl's name and sacrifice will not be forgotten. Every resident who uses that street, every visitor who notices the sign, is reminded that a German major chose to die protecting French prisoners from his own countrymen. The street name does not erase Gangl's earlier service to the Nazi regime, but it honours his final choice and recognises that redemption is possible for those brave enough to reject evil, even when doing so costs everything. The story of the battle is ultimately a story of hope. Hope that people can change, that enemies can reconcile, that courage can triumph over evil, and that humanity's better angels can prevail even in the darkest circumstances. On May 5, 1945, in the dying hours of history's deadliest war, a group of unlikely allies proved that these things are not just possible, but achievable. Their legacy continues to inspire, challenge, and remind us of what humans can accomplish when we choose to see the humanity in others, even our enemies, and act with courage and principle regardless of the cost. The Battle of Castle Itter teaches us that redemption is possible, that former enemies can become allies, that individual moral courage can change outcomes, that shared values matter more than national identity, and that it is never too late to choose the right side. These lessons, learned on a hillside in Austria 80 years ago, remain as relevant today as they were in 1945, reminding us that the choices we make in moments of crisis define not just our own character, but the future we leave for generations to come.